My golden child brother laughed at me at Thanksgiving when I announced my business idea and called it embarrassing. 6 years later, he sent me his application letter. My brother Keith was the golden child. 4 years older, better grades, better job, better everything according to our parents. He went to a good university, got a degree in finance, and landed a position at a big investment firm right out of school. He wore expensive suits, drove a nice car, and never let anyone forget how successful he was. I took a different path. I went to community college, studied graphic design, and worked freelance for years. I made decent money, but nothing impressive. Keith loved to remind me of the gap between us. Every holiday, every family dinner, he'd find a way to mention his bonus, his promotion, his new watch. He'd ask about my work in this pitying voice, like I was a child showing him a finger painting. When I was 28, I had an idea. I'd been doing freelance design for small businesses, and I noticed most of them struggled with their online presence. They needed websites, logos, social media content, but they couldn't afford to hire separate people for each thing. I thought I could build a company that offered all of it in one package. I spent 6 months planning. I saved every dollar I could. I talked to potential clients. I built a business plan. When I finally felt ready, I made the mistake of telling my family at Thanksgiving. Keith laughed before I even finished explaining. He said the market was saturated. He said I'd burn through my savings and come crawling back to freelance work within a year. Then he looked at our parents and said it was embarrassing that I was even considering this. Our parents didn't defend me. Our mom said maybe Keith had a point. Our dad said I should think carefully before throwing away my stability. Keith smiled the whole time. That smug, superior smile he'd been giving me my whole life. I didn't argue with him. I just finished my dinner and went home. The next week, I filed the paperwork and officially started my company. I called it Bridge Creative. The first year was brutal. Keith was right about one thing. I had no business experience. I made mistakes constantly. I underpriced projects, overpromised on timelines, and nearly burned out trying to do everything myself. There were months I couldn't pay myself. I lived on rice and eggs and hope, but I kept going. I learned from every mistake. I raised my prices. I got better at managing my time. I found clients who valued quality and referred me to others. By the end of year 1, I was still standing. Barely, but standing. Keith asked about my little project at Christmas that year. His tone made it clear he expected me to admit failure. I told him business was growing. He said that was cute and changed the subject. Year 2 was better. I hired my first employee, a designer I'd worked with on freelance projects. We split the workload and took on bigger clients. Revenue doubled. I moved out of my apartment and into a small office space. Year 3 was when everything changed. I landed a contract with a regional restaurant chain that needed a complete rebrand. That project led to 3 more. Word spread. Suddenly I wasn't chasing clients anymore. They were coming to me. By year 4, I had 12 employees and a real office downtown. We'd won a few local business awards. A trade magazine did a profile on us. I was making more money than I ever had in my life. I stopped going to family dinners. Not because I was too busy, though I was, because I was tired of Keith's comments and my parents' indifference. I sent gifts on holidays and called on birthdays. That was enough. I heard updates about Keith through our mom. His firm went through layoffs. He survived the first round, then the second. Then the third round caught him. He'd been there 15 years and suddenly he was unemployed. He spent a few months looking for something equivalent. Finance jobs were scarce. His salary expectations didn't match the market. His age didn't help. He took a consulting gig that paid half what he used to make. That dried up after 8 months. Last I heard, he was doing some kind of independent financial advising from home, which meant he was unemployed and pretending he wasn't. I felt bad for him, honestly. Losing a career you built your identity around is brutal. I thought about reaching out, but I didn't know what I'd say. Then, 3 weeks ago, my HR manager came to me with a stack of applications. We were hiring for an account coordinator position. Entry level, client-facing, decent salary with room to grow. She said one of the applicants had an unusual background. Finance guy, overqualified on paper, but no relevant experience in our industry. She showed me the resume. Keith. My brother had applied for a job at my company. He used his real name. He listed his finance experience. He wrote a cover letter about wanting to transition into a more creative field. He mentioned being passionate about helping small businesses. He didn't mention that the founder of the company was his younger brother. I told my HR manager I'd handle this one personally. I called Keith that afternoon. He sounded surprised to hear from me. I asked him about the application. He got quiet for a moment, then laughed. It was awkward. He knew it was awkward, but he needed me to know he was serious about this job. His voice had this weird mix of trying to sound casual while I could hear something underneath it that I'd never heard from Keith before. Desperation. Real desperation, not the fake kind he used to put on when he wanted something from our parents. This was different. This was my brother who'd spent his whole life looking down at me, now asking me for help without actually saying the words, and I had no idea what to say back. I opened my mouth twice and closed it again. Finally, I told him I'd review his application through our normal process, and he'd hear back in 2 weeks. Professional, distant, safe. He started to say something. I could hear him take a breath, and I knew he was about to bring up family, about to make this personal, but he stopped himself, just said thanks and hung up. I sat there staring at my phone for a minute, wondering what he'd been about to say. I spent the next hour in my office with Keith's resume spread out on my desk next to his cover letter. The finance stuff was impressive, I had to admit that. 15 years at a major firm, multiple promotions, client portfolio management. But there was this gap, 3 years that he was trying to hide with vague language about consulting and independent financial advising. I saw right through it. Those were the years he'd been unemployed and scrambling, taking whatever scraps he could find, watching his career fall apart while mine kept growing. His cover letter talked about passion for helping small businesses and wanting to work in a more creative field. It sounded rehearsed, like he'd written and rewritten it a dozen times trying to find the right words that would make him sound genuine instead of desperate. Valerie knocked on my door around 3. She had this look on her face, the one she gets when she knows something's complicated, but she's going to ask about it anyway. She wanted to know about the application, about whether I was going to handle it myself or recuse myself from the process. I hadn't decided until that moment. I told her I'd personally manage this candidate's process. She gave me this knowing look, like she understood exactly what I was doing, even if I didn't. But she didn't question it. Just nodded and left me alone with Keith's paperwork and my thoughts. That night I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed staring at my ceiling, replaying that Thanksgiving dinner 6 years ago over and over in my head. Keith's laugh when I mentioned my business idea, not a little chuckle, but this full laugh like I'd told the funniest joke he'd ever heard. The way he looked at our parents, this glance that said, "Can you believe this?" Like they were all witnessing something pathetic together. That word hanging in the air, embarrassing. He'd called my dream embarrassing in front of everyone, and our mom had agreed with him, and our dad had told me to think carefully, and nobody had defended me. Nobody had said maybe it could work. Maybe I should try. I remembered finishing my dinner in silence, driving home alone, sitting in my apartment and deciding I was going to do it anyway, just to prove them all wrong. I gave up on sleep around 6 and went into the office early. I spent the morning researching what had happened to Keith's firm. The financial news articles painted this picture of industry contraction, regulation changes, market shifts. His firm had done 3 rounds of layoffs over 2 years. I pulled up Keith's LinkedIn profile, which he kept updated even though he wasn't working anywhere. He'd been cut in the second round, not the first. That told me something. The first round was the obvious cuts, the people who weren't performing. The second round was when they started looking at cost versus value, and apparently Keith hadn't been valuable enough to keep. The third round happened 6 months after he was already gone. I sat there looking at his profile picture, this professional headshot where he looked confident and successful, and wondered how long it had been since he'd felt that way. Theo showed up at my office around 10 with 2 cups of coffee. He took one look at me and asked if I was okay because I'd been distracted all morning. I hadn't even realized he'd noticed. I ended up telling him the whole thing, about Keith's application, about our history, about the Thanksgiving dinner. Theo whistled low and said that was complicated as hell. He sat down in the chair across from my desk and asked what I was going to do. I realized I didn't know. Part of me wanted to reject Keith immediately, just send him a standard rejection email and feel that rush of vindication. He'd laughed at my dream, and now he needed me, and I could make him feel exactly how he'd made me feel. Small, dismissed, not good enough. But another part of me was curious about who Keith had become. The guy on the phone hadn't sounded like my arrogant older brother. He'd sounded humbled, maybe even broken, and I wanted to know if that was real or just an act to get the job. I decided to treat this like any other application. I told Theo I was sending Keith's resume to our external recruiter for the initial screening. We used her for all our hires, someone outside the company who could be objective. If she found problems, or if Keith bombed the basic assessment we give all candidates, then the decision would be made for me. I wouldn't have to be the one to reject him. Theo nodded and said that was smart, keeping it professional. The recruiter called me back 2 days later. She said Keith's finance background was overqualified for the account coordinator role, which was entry-level, but his assessment showed real ability for client relationship management. He'd scored high on communication skills, problem-solving, adaptability. She recommended doing a phone screen to figure out if his interest in the creative industry was genuine or if he was just desperate for any job. I told her I'd handle the phone screen myself. I scheduled the phone interview for the next afternoon. Keith picked up before the first ring finished, and when he said my name, it came out careful and professional instead of the dismissive way he usually said it. I could hear something different in his voice, something tight and nervous that told me how badly he needed this job. I opened with standard interview questions, asking why he wanted to transition into creative services after spending 15 years in finance. He gave me an answer that sounded rehearsed, talking about meaningful client relationships and helping small businesses grow. It was polished and safe, the kind of thing you'd say in any interview. I cut him off and asked him to be honest about what he was running from instead of what he was running toward. The silence stretched out long enough that I checked my phone to make sure the call hadn't dropped. Then Keith started talking, and his voice lost that professional coating. He told me his finance career was dead, completely over, no going back. The industry had changed while he was busy thinking his experience made him valuable. Companies wanted people who could code, who understood data analytics and cryptocurrency and all the tech innovations he'd dismissed as passing trends. He was too expensive for his experience level because younger people with better technical skills would work for half his old salary. His voice cracked slightly when he said he needed to completely reinvent himself or accept that his professional life peaked at 42. I asked if he remembered what he said about my business idea 6 years ago. Another long silence. Then he said quietly that he remembered and he was wrong. I could tell it cost him something to admit that, to acknowledge that the little brother he'd spent decades looking down on had been right about something important. Keith kept talking without me asking another question. He said he'd been following Bridge Creative's growth for the past 2 years. He saw the trade magazine profile, noticed our client list expanding on LinkedIn, watched me build something real while his own career crumbled. The envy in his voice was so raw it made me uncomfortable, like I was seeing something too private. He talked about driving past my office downtown and seeing the Bridge Creative sign, about telling people at networking events that his brother ran a successful agency, using my success to make himself seem less like a failure. I let the silence sit for a minute after he stopped talking. Then I told him I'd consider his application seriously, but he needed to understand what he was applying for. This would be entry-level work reporting to people younger than him. He'd be taking direction from a senior account director who was 30 years old. He'd be doing tasks that might feel beneath someone with his background. The salary was decent, but nowhere near what he used to make. He said he understood, and I believed him, because he sounded defeated in a way I'd never heard from Keith before. Not angry or defensive, just worn down by months of rejection and reality. I ended the call and sat looking at my phone for a while. That weekend, I drove to my parents' house for my mom's birthday dinner. Keith wasn't there when I arrived, and when I asked about him, my dad said he'd been avoiding family gatherings because he was embarrassed about being unemployed. My mom set out the food and asked if I'd talked to Keith lately. I mentioned he'd applied to work at my company. She looked shocked, her hands stopping halfway through cutting the cake. Then she said, maybe I could help him out since he was having such a hard time, completely missing the irony of asking me to rescue the brother who'd laughed at my ambitions. I asked my mom if she remembered Thanksgiving 6 years ago when Keith called my business idea embarrassing. She frowned and said she didn't really recall that. I watched her face and realized she genuinely didn't remember because my humiliation hadn't registered as important enough to stick in her memory. Keith's opinions had always mattered more than my feelings in this house. My dad said Keith was going through a tough time, and family should help family. I pointed out that Keith hadn't helped me when I was struggling, when I was eating rice and eggs and wondering if I'd made a terrible mistake. My dad looked uncomfortable and changed the subject to something about the weather, proving that even now my parents saw Keith's problems as more real and legitimate than mine had ever been. I drove home that night, replaying every moment of the dinner, the way my mom looked confused when I mentioned Thanksgiving 6 years ago, the way my dad changed the subject when I pointed out Keith never helped me, the way neither of them seemed to understand that asking me to rescue Keith now felt like a slap in the face after they watched him mock my dreams and said nothing. I parked in my driveway and sat there for 20 minutes, hands on the steering wheel, staring at nothing. Part of me wanted to call Keith right now and tell him the job was his, just to prove I was better than he'd ever been to me. Another part wanted to reject his application and let him keep struggling, let him feel what it was like when nobody believed in you. A third part, the part I didn't want to acknowledge, just felt tired of carrying around all this anger and resentment like rocks in my pockets. Monday morning, I opened my email and typed a message to Keith before I could change my mind. Professional and brief. Interview scheduled for Wednesday at 10. Our office downtown. He responded in under 5 minutes saying he'd be there. I forwarded the details to Theo and Valerie with a note that we were interviewing a candidate with an unusual background, and I wanted their honest assessment. Theo replied asking if this was the brother situation I'd mentioned. I confirmed and asked him to treat it like any other panel interview. He sent back a thumbs up emoji and nothing else, which I appreciated. Wednesday morning, I got to the office early and rearranged my desk 3 times for no reason. I checked my phone constantly. At 9:50, I stood by the window watching the street below, and at 9:58, I saw Keith walking toward our building. He moved differently than I remembered. Less confident, more careful, like someone who'd learned to watch where they stepped. I moved away from the window and sat at my desk, pretending to read emails I'd already answered twice. Valerie called my extension at 10 on the dot. Keith had arrived. I told her to show him to the main conference room and let him wait there for a few minutes while I got Theo. Standard interview protocol, but also I needed the time to get my head straight. I found Theo at his desk reviewing the resume I'd sent him. He looked up and said Keith's credentials were solid, but the gap in employment was concerning. I nodded and said that's why we were doing this interview. He stood and grabbed his notebook and we walked to the conference room together. Keith was standing by the window when we entered, looking out at the view of downtown. He turned when he heard us, and I saw what I'd noticed from the street. His suit hung loose on his frame, the shoulders slightly too wide, the pants pooling a bit at his shoes. He'd lost weight, probably 20 pounds. He smiled when he saw me, but it didn't reach his eyes, and he shook Theo's hand when I introduced them with the kind of careful politeness people use when they're trying too hard. We all sat down. Theo across from Keith, me at the head of the table. Valerie joined us a minute later with her laptop and a legal pad. Theo started with the standard questions. Why are you interested in this position? What attracts you to creative services? Keith's answers were rehearsed but not robotic. He talked about wanting to help small businesses succeed, about finding meaning in work that made a real difference for clients. He mentioned his finance background could help with budget discussions and ROI conversations. All good answers, professional, competent. I watched him and tried to see him as just another candidate instead of the brother who'd laughed at my dreams. Valerie asked about his employment gap. Keith didn't flinch. He said his previous firm went through restructuring and his position was eliminated. He'd spent time doing consulting work but realized he wanted a complete career change rather than staying in an industry that didn't excite him anymore. The way he said it was smooth, practiced, like he'd given this answer to 10 other interviewers already. Valerie made notes and moved on. Then Theo asked about his biggest career failure. The question hung in the air for a second. Keith's careful composure shifted. His shoulders dropped slightly. He looked down at his hands on the table, and I saw his thumb rubbing against his index finger, a nervous habit I remembered from childhood. When he looked back up, his face had changed. The professional mask had cracked. He said his biggest failure was being too proud to see his industry changing around him. He'd been successful for so long that he stopped questioning his own approach. He dismissed new technologies and methods because his old ways had always worked. He didn't listen to younger colleagues who saw problems he was blind to. He spent too much time talking about past successes instead of adapting to current realities. By the time he realized he needed to change, it was too late. The layoffs came, and he was expendable, because he'd made himself irrelevant. His voice was steady, but I heard something underneath it. Something raw and honest that I'd never heard from Keith before. I recognized myself in what he was saying. Not the arrogance part, but the struggle. The hard lessons learned through failure. The humiliation of realizing you'd been doing everything wrong. I'd felt all of that during my first year running Bridge Creative, those months when I couldn't pay myself, and wondered if Keith had been right about me burning through my savings. The difference was, I'd learned those lessons on my way up. Keith was learning them on his way down. The interview continued for another 20 minutes. Keith answered every question thoughtfully. He asked smart questions about our client base and company culture. He didn't mention once that I was his brother or that he'd known me his whole life. He treated me like a CEO he was trying to impress, and watching that reversal should have felt satisfying, should have felt like vindication. Instead, it just felt strange and uncomfortable and sad. After Keith left, Theo and Valerie and I stayed in the conference room. Theo spoke first. He said Keith was clearly overqualified on paper, but seemed genuinely humbled by his experience. His finance background could legitimately help with client budget discussions, especially with our bigger accounts where ROI conversations got complicated. But he was concerned about the family dynamics. Having my brother work here could create weird power dynamics with the rest of the team. Valerie agreed. She said Keith seemed sincere, but she worried about what would happen if he didn't work out. Firing family was messy. It could poison the workplace culture. I listened to them lay out all the practical concerns I'd been thinking about for days. Before I could respond, Fiona appeared in the doorway. Our CFO had been with the company for 3 years and never hesitated to ask hard questions. She pulled out a chair and sat down without being invited, which was very Fiona. She looked at me and asked the question nobody else would. Was I considering hiring Keith because he was actually qualified for the role, or because I wanted him to see my success up close, or because I wanted to prove I was the bigger person. She said all three were understandable, but only one was a good reason to hire someone. I opened my mouth to answer and realized I didn't have a good one. I didn't know which reason was driving me. Maybe all three, maybe none of them. I told Fiona I needed to think about it. She nodded and said that was fair, but I should figure out my real motivation before making a decision that affected the whole team. Then she left as quickly as she'd arrived. That night I sat at my desk at home with Keith's resume open on my laptop. He'd listed 3 references, all former colleagues instead of supervisors, which was odd for someone with 15 years of experience. I picked up my phone and called the first one. A woman named Sandra picked up after 2 rings. I introduced myself as the CEO of Bridge Creative and said Keith had applied for a position with us. She got quiet for a second, then asked if I was his brother. I said yes. She said she'd figured that might be the case. Sandra chose her words carefully. She said Keith was technically very competent, brilliant with numbers and financial modeling, but he struggled in their changing workplace culture. Their firm had been trying to modernize, bring in new approaches, flatten hierarchies. Keith resisted all of it. He had difficulty accepting feedback from younger team members. He'd reference his past successes constantly instead of engaging with current projects on their own terms. People stopped wanting to work with him because he made them feel small and inexperienced, even when they had valid points. I asked if she thought Keith could change. Sandra paused for a long time. She said Keith was smart enough to understand what he needed to do differently. The question was whether he was humble enough to actually do it. She said he'd need to completely rebuild his professional identity, let go of who he used to be, and she wasn't sure anyone could do that level of personal transformation, especially someone who'd been successful for so long. Then she said something that stuck with me. She said Keith needed someone willing to give him a real chance, but also willing to hold him accountable, and those 2 things were hard to balance. I thanked her and hung up. I sat with what she'd said for 2 days. I checked Keith's LinkedIn profile multiple times and saw he'd been posting comments on creative industry articles, thoughtful observations about brand storytelling and digital marketing trends. The effort he was putting into reinventing himself was obvious. Every post was him trying to prove he belonged in this new world. I remember doing the same thing 6 years ago, posting about design theory and small business marketing, trying to establish myself as someone who knew what they were talking about, even though I was terrified I didn't. Friday afternoon, I met Melody for coffee at the place near our office. She was one of my major clients, a woman in her 50s who ran a successful nonprofit. We'd been working together for 2 years, and she'd become something like a mentor. We talked about her upcoming campaign for a while, then the conversation drifted. She mentioned she'd transitioned from corporate law to nonprofit work 5 years ago. I'd known this but never heard the full story. Melody said leaving law had been the hardest thing she'd ever done. She'd spent 20 years building her reputation, making partner, earning respect. When she announced she was leaving to run a small nonprofit, people from her old life acted like she'd lost her mind. They asked if she was having a breakdown. They told her she was throwing away everything she'd worked for. The first year was brutal. She had no idea how to run a nonprofit. She made mistakes constantly. People she used to work with would see her at events and ask how her little charity project was going in voices that made it clear they expected her to fail and come back. But the struggle made her better at what she did. It taught her things she never would have learned staying comfortable in corporate law. I asked her if she'd wanted someone from her past to give her a real chance during her switch to nonprofit work. She put down her coffee and thought about it for a while. She said absolutely, but only if they could actually see her as the person she was becoming instead of who she'd been before. She said the worst part wasn't people doubting her skills. It was people who couldn't let go of her old identity and kept treating her like a lawyer playing at charity work. I felt something click into place when she said that. The question wasn't whether Keith deserved this job or whether I wanted revenge. The question was whether I could see him as someone genuinely trying to change paths instead of the brother who laughed at me 6 years ago. I thanked her for the coffee and headed back to my car. I sat there for 20 minutes before I pulled out my phone and called Keith. I told him we needed to talk in person, off the record, no formal interview. He agreed immediately and suggested a coffee shop near my office. I said no, somewhere neutral, and gave him the address of a place halfway between us. We set it for the next morning at 9. Keith was already there when I arrived. He sat at a corner table with a plain black coffee in front of him, no fancy drink, no pastry. I noticed that first. Every other time I'd seen him at a coffee place, he ordered some complicated espresso thing that cost $7. His suit looked the same as the one he'd worn to the interview, and I wondered if it was the only one that still fit him properly. He'd lost weight. Not a lot, but enough that his collar looked loose and his face had a harder edge to it. He stood up when he saw me, then sat back down like he wasn't sure what the protocol was for meeting your younger brother who might give you a job. I got my own coffee and joined him at the table. I didn't waste time on small talk. I told him I needed complete honesty about why he wanted this position. Was it just desperation because he needed any job? Was it convenience because I was family and he thought that gave him an advantage? Or was there actual genuine interest in the work we did at Bridge Creative? He stared at his coffee for a long time, long enough that the silence got uncomfortable. When he finally looked up, his face had this careful expression like he was trying to figure out what answer I wanted to hear. I told him not to do that, not to calculate his response. Just tell me the truth. He admitted it started as desperation. He'd been applying everywhere, getting nowhere, and when he saw the Bridge Creative posting, he thought maybe, just maybe, being my brother would help instead of hurt him for once. But then he actually researched the company. He looked at our client list, read the case studies on our website, watched some of the brand videos we'd produced. He said something shifted for him. Finance had become soulless over the years. Just numbers and competition and people stepping on each other to get ahead. He'd spent 15 years in that world and realized he didn't actually care about any of it anymore. But the idea of helping businesses tell their stories, connecting them with customers, building something that actually meant something to the people involved, that felt different. That felt like work that mattered. I asked him what he'd do if I rejected his application. Would he just find another creative agency to apply to, or would he go back to finance? He shook his head and said he'd probably keep looking for a while, maybe end up taking some corporate finance role eventually because he had bills to pay. But he'd spend the rest of his career wondering what would have happened if he'd been brave enough to really change paths instead of taking the safe option. He'd wonder if he could have been good at something that actually made him happy instead of just made him money. Then Keith did something I didn't expect. He looked directly at me, not at his coffee or the table or anywhere else, and said he knew he didn't deserve my help. He said the Thanksgiving comment was cruel. He'd called my business idea embarrassing in front of our parents, and that was unforgivable. He said it came from his own fear. I was doing something brave by starting my own company, taking a real risk, and he'd been too scared to ever do anything like that. He'd always played it safe, followed the expected path, and seeing me step off that path made him feel threatened. So he tried to tear me down instead of supporting me. Hearing him say it out loud, finally acknowledging what he'd done and why, made something loosen in my chest that I hadn't realized was tight. I didn't respond to the apology right away. Instead, I asked him what he thought he could actually contribute to Bridge Creative beyond his finance background. I wanted to know if he'd really thought this through or if he was just desperate enough to say anything. He'd thought about it. He talked about client relationship management, understanding business owner psychology from his years working with executives and entrepreneurs. He said he could help translate creative concepts into ROI language that would make sense to clients who thought in numbers. He could bridge the gap between our designers who thought in aesthetics and clients who thought in revenue. The way he described it showed he'd actually studied what we did and where he might fit. We ended up talking for 2 hours. The coffee shop filled up and emptied out again around us. I watched Keith explain his ideas for how he'd approach different client scenarios, and I saw glimpses of someone different from the brother I grew up with. He was still proud. You could see it in how he sat and talked, but it was tempered now by actual failure and actual humility. He was still competitive, but more self-aware about it, like he understood that competition had been part of what destroyed his finance career. I realized people could change when circumstances forced them to face their own limits. Losing everything he'd built his identity around had broken something in Keith, but maybe it had also created space for him to become someone better. I told him I'd make my decision within a week. He thanked me and said whatever I decided, he appreciated me taking him seriously instead of just rejecting him outright. He said he knew he would have done exactly that if our positions were reversed 6 years ago. He would have enjoyed rejecting me, would have seen it as proof he'd been right all along. The fact that I was even considering him meant I was a better person than he'd been, and he knew it. Back at the office, I found Valerie in her workspace and asked her to pull analytics on our account coordinator turnover. She gave me a questioning look, but pulled up the data. The numbers weren't great. The role Keith had applied for had high burnout rates because it was demanding client-facing work with tight deadlines and difficult personalities. We'd hired 4 people for that position in the last 2 years. 2 quit within 6 months, 1 we had to let go for performance issues, and only 1 was still with us and thriving. I needed to know if Keith could actually handle that kind of pressure given everything he'd just been through. Career trauma was real, and throwing someone into a high-stress role right after they'd lost their previous career could break them completely. Valerie asked if I was seriously considering hiring my brother, and I told her I was trying to figure out if it was the right move for the company or just something I wanted to do for complicated personal reasons I didn't fully understand yet. She gave me a look that said she understood this was about more than just filling a position. And I spent that evening alone in my apartment with Keith's file spread across my kitchen table. His resume listed 3 major accounts he'd managed at the investment firm, all of them businesses in the $20 to $50 million range. He'd handled their portfolio management, risk assessment, and financial planning. The cover letter talked about wanting to help small businesses grow, about finding meaning in work that directly impacted people's lives. I pulled up our current client list and started making notes. The restaurant chain was expanding into 4 new locations and kept pushing back on our branding package because they couldn't see how design work translated to increased revenue. Keith could explain that in their language. We had a boutique hotel group that wanted a complete digital overhaul, but their owner kept questioning every line item in our proposal. Keith could break down the numbers in ways that made sense to business owners who thought in profit margins. There was a local brewery that needed rebranding, but their founder was a former accountant who wanted spreadsheets showing projected return on investment for every creative decision. Keith would understand that mindset because he'd lived in it for 15 years. I made a list of 8 current projects where Keith's background could genuinely help. Not because he was my brother, but because we actually needed someone who could speak both creative and business fluently. By Sunday night, I'd built a case for hiring him that had nothing to do with family and everything to do with what Bridge Creative needed to grow. Monday morning, I called Theo, Fiona, and Valerie into the main conference room. The 3 of them were my core leadership team, and I trusted their judgment more than my own sometimes. They sat down looking curious and slightly concerned because I'd marked the meeting as urgent. I told them everything. I started with Thanksgiving 6 years ago, and Keith's laugh when I announced my business idea. I explained how he'd called it embarrassing in front of our parents, how nobody had defended me, how I'd gone home that night and decided to prove him wrong. I showed them Keith's application and resume, walked them through his qualifications and his 3-year gap, explained about the layoffs and failed job search. I laid out the family dynamics, the golden child versus disappointment dynamic, the fact that hiring Keith would mean my older brother working for me at an entry-level position. I asked them to tell me honestly whether hiring Keith would be good for Bridge Creative or just good for my ego. The room got quiet. Fiona pulled Keith's resume across the table and studied it carefully. Theo leaned back in his chair and stared at the ceiling. Valerie made notes on her tablet with quick, precise movements. After what felt like 10 minutes, Theo spoke first. He said Keith's finance background could definitely help with client relationships, especially the ones who needed creative work explained in business terms. He said the skills were there, and the humility in Keith's application seemed real. But he also said the family stuff was complicated and asked if I could actually manage Keith like any other employee instead of my older brother. He said if I couldn't separate those things, it would poison the whole team dynamic. Fiona jumped in next. She said her concern was setting a precedent for hiring family members. Bridge Creative had always been professional and merit-based, and bringing in relatives could make other employees question whether advancement was about performance or connections. She said if we hired Keith, we needed clear boundaries and he couldn't get special treatment just because he was related to the CEO. She also pointed out that Keith might struggle with authority given his age and experience level, taking direction from people younger than him in an industry he didn't know. Valerie had been quiet through both of their assessments, still making notes. When she finally looked up, she said, Keith's humility seemed genuine based on the application and phone screen, but humility under pressure was different from humility when things were going well. She suggested a probationary period with very clear performance metrics. She said we should measure his client satisfaction scores, his ability to work with the creative team, and his willingness to take feedback. She said if he couldn't handle criticism or started acting superior once he was comfortable, we needed to be willing to let him go regardless of family ties. I listened to all of it and realized they were giving me the honest input I'd asked for. Nobody was telling me what they thought I wanted to hear. Theo thought it could work if I managed it right. Fiona worried about precedent and team morale. Valerie wanted clear metrics and accountability. The consensus was that Keith could potentially be valuable, but only if I could actually be his boss instead of his younger brother. Only if I could evaluate him fairly, give him critical feedback when needed, and fire him if he didn't perform or if the family dynamics became toxic. I sat with that for a moment. They were asking if I trusted myself to hold Keith accountable the same way I would any other employee. To not give him special treatment or let old family patterns creep into our professional relationship. To be willing to let him go if it didn't work out, even though that would create massive family drama. I thought about the person I'd become building Bridge Creative. Someone who'd made hard decisions about employees who weren't working out. Someone who'd had difficult conversations about performance and let people go when they couldn't meet standards. Someone who'd built a company culture based on merit and results, not favoritism or politics. I believed I could do this. I could be Keith's boss instead of his little brother. I could evaluate him fairly and hold him to the same standards as everyone else. And if it didn't work out, I could make the hard call to let him go. I told my team I appreciated their honesty, and I thought we should move forward with clear conditions. 3-month probationary period with specific performance metrics. Keith would report to Theo, instead of directly to me, to maintain professional boundaries. Regular check-ins to assess how the family dynamic was affecting team morale. And if any of them saw warning signs that this wasn't working, they needed to tell me immediately. They all agreed. Fiona said she'd draft the employment terms with the probationary language. Valerie said she'd set up the performance tracking system. Theo said he'd plan Keith's onboarding and training schedule. I thanked them and went back to my office to call Keith. He answered on the second ring. I told him I was offering him the account coordinator position with some conditions we needed to discuss. There was a pause, then his voice came back shaky and relieved at the same time. I laid out the terms. 3 months probationary with clear performance metrics he'd need to hit. He'd report to Theo, not to me, to keep professional boundaries. We'd evaluate at the end of 3 months and decide whether to make it permanent. He said yes before I finished explaining. He said he understood the conditions and appreciated the chance. He said he knew this was complicated given our history, and he wouldn't let me down. The relief in his voice was so clear it made me uncomfortable. I told him to come in Monday morning for orientation and ended the call. I sat there for a while after, staring at my phone and trying to figure out how I felt. Satisfied that I'd made a fair decision based on business needs. Nervous about how this would actually play out. Curious about whether Keith could really handle starting over at the bottom. A little bit vindicated that my brother would be working for me in the company he'd called embarrassing. Keith started the following Monday. I watched from my office as Valerie took him through orientation, showed him his desk in the open floor plan area where the account coordinators worked, introduced him to the team. He was wearing a suit that looked slightly too big, like he'd lost weight and hadn't replaced his wardrobe yet. He shook hands with people, smiled politely, took notes while Valerie explained our systems and processes. When Theo came to collect him for their first meeting, I saw Keith's posture change. He stood a little straighter, followed Theo to a conference room, sat down across from someone 8 years younger who would be his direct supervisor. The satisfaction I'd expected to feel was there, but it was mixed with something else. Discomfort, maybe, or uncertainty about whether this had been the right call. Over the next 2 weeks, Keith was painfully formal with me. He'd pass me in the hallway and nod professionally like I was a stranger. In meetings where we were both present, he'd address me as sir or refer to me as the CEO instead of using my name. Other employees noticed. They knew he was my brother because word had spread quickly through the office, and they watched our interactions with obvious curiosity. I realized the awkwardness was making everyone uncomfortable, not just us. Keith was trying so hard to maintain professional distance that it was creating weird tension. I needed to address it directly instead of letting it fester. I called an all-hands meeting on a Friday afternoon. The whole team gathered in our main workspace, about 15 people total, including Keith. I stood up front and said I wanted to acknowledge something that everyone already knew, but nobody was talking about. Keith was my brother. Our relationship had been complicated for a long time. He was here because he had skills we needed, and he'd gone through the same application process as any other candidate. He'd be evaluated on his performance like everyone else. If anyone had concerns about favoritism or special treatment, they should come to me directly. I looked at Keith while I said it. He met my eyes for the first time since he'd started, and I saw something like gratitude there. The team seemed to relax after that. The weird tension eased. People started treating Keith like a normal new employee instead of the boss's brother, who nobody knew how to interact with. Theo assigned Keith to work with one of our designers on the restaurant chain rebrand expansion. I sat in on the first client meeting to observe. Keith was good. He listened to the client's concerns about budget and timeline, then translated our designer's creative concepts into financial projections that showed projected customer increase and revenue impact. The client's whole posture changed. They'd been skeptical and resistant, but Keith spoke their language. He showed them numbers that made the creative work make sense in business terms. By the end of the meeting, they'd approved the expanded scope and increased their budget. Our designer came up to me afterward and said Keith was exactly what she needed for clients who didn't understand creative value. I watched our team gather their materials after the client meeting. Keith stayed behind, organizing the presentation notes with careful attention that reminded me of someone trying to prove they belonged somewhere new. The next few weeks passed without major drama. Keith showed up early, stayed late when projects needed it, and gradually stopped looking surprised when people asked his opinion. He fit into the team's rhythm without the friction I'd worried about. One evening around 7, I walked past the conference room and saw him hunched over his laptop, tie loosened and sleeves rolled up. The pitch deck on the screen had gone through at least 5 revisions based on the version numbers in the corner. He glanced up when I knocked on the glass door frame. His expression went sheepish, like I'd caught him doing something wrong instead of just working overtime. He said he wanted to make sure the restaurant chain presentation was perfect, that he was trying to prove he deserved to be here. I told him he didn't need to prove anything, just needed to do solid work like everyone else. He nodded, but his shoulders stayed tense, and I recognized that desperate need for validation from my own early days building the company. The restaurant chain meeting happened 3 days later. Their marketing director spent the first 10 minutes skeptical about expanding the rebrand to their catering division. Keith walked through the financial projections with the kind of confidence that only comes from actually understanding numbers. He showed them customer retention data, explained how consistent branding across divisions would increase their perceived value, and translated our designers' creative concepts into revenue forecasts. By the end of his presentation, the marketing director was asking when we could start. After the client left, Theo pulled me aside in the hallway. He said the client specifically requested Keith for their next project, praised his ability to make creative work make sense in business terms. Keith was standing close enough to hear, and I watched his whole face change. That look of professional validation, of being valued for current contribution instead of past credentials, reminded me why I'd taken the risk of hiring him. 2 months into Keith's employment, my mom called and invited both of us to Sunday dinner. She said it had been too long since we were all together, used that careful voice that meant she was trying to fix something without acknowledging what was broken. I almost said no out of habit, then realized I was curious about how family dinner would feel now that the power dynamic had shifted so completely. Keith and I drove separately to our parents' suburban house. The dining room looked exactly like it always had. Same table where Keith had laughed at my business idea 6 years earlier. But everything felt different. My mom kept glancing between us during dinner like she was trying to solve a puzzle. She'd ask Keith about work, and he'd answer honestly about learning the creative industry. Then she'd look at me like she expected me to contradict him or make it awkward. My dad finally asked directly how Keith was doing at the company. Keith started to answer, but I jumped in first. I said he was exceeding expectations, that our clients specifically requested him, that the team appreciated his ability to bridge creative vision with business reality. Keith's face showed genuine surprise that I was praising him in front of our parents instead of using the opportunity to make him feel small. My mom's eyes got shiny with tears, though I wasn't sure if she was crying because Keith was doing well or because she finally understood what it meant that he was working for me. My dad nodded slowly and said he was glad we were both doing well, which was the closest he'd come to acknowledging that maybe they'd been wrong about my business idea all those years ago. After dinner, Keith and I ended up in the kitchen doing dishes while our parents sat in the living room. He handed me a wet plate and said thank you for giving him this chance. The words came out quiet but genuine. I dried the plate and realized something had shifted inside me. I didn't feel vindictive anymore. Watching him rebuild his confidence and find work he actually cared about felt more satisfying than any revenge could have been. The anger I'd carried for 6 years had burned down to something smaller and less sharp. Keith scrubbed another plate and asked if I ever thought about that Thanksgiving dinner. I admitted I'd thought about it constantly while building the company, that his laugh and the word embarrassing had fueled a lot of late nights when I wanted to quit. He nodded and said he thought about it too, about how wrong he'd been and how his arrogance almost cost him the chance to do work that actually mattered. We finished the dishes in comfortable silence that felt new for us. 3 months after Keith started, I sat down with Theo for his probationary review. Theo's assessment was straightforward and positive. Keith had strong performance marks across all metrics. The team liked working with him, and clients consistently gave good feedback. Theo recommended keeping him on permanently without hesitation. I called a team meeting and asked for honest input about making Keith's position permanent. The consensus was clear. He'd become a valuable contributor who was genuinely committed to learning the industry instead of just coasting on past credentials. Nobody had concerns about favoritism or special treatment because Keith had earned his place through actual work. I called Keith into my office the next day and offered him a permanent position with a small raise. He accepted immediately, then told me something I hadn't expected. He said this job saved him from becoming bitter and stuck, that having to start over and prove himself again reminded him why he loved working in the first place. Before the layoffs, he'd been going through motions, chasing status and salary without caring about the actual work. Now he was making less money, but felt more engaged than he had in years. I watched him leave my office and thought about how strange it was that we'd both ended up better off because his career fell apart. 6 months after Keith's application landed on my desk, we won a major contract with a regional healthcare network. The client had been skeptical about investing in a complete digital rebrand during budget constraints. Keith's pitch presentation changed their minds. He showed them specific data about how improved online presence would reduce their customer service costs and increase patient retention. He spoke their language about ROI and quarterly projections, while our designers spoke about user experience and visual identity. The combination convinced them to approve a 6-month project worth more than any single contract we'd landed before. The whole team celebrated at a bar downtown that night. I watched Keith laughing with colleagues who respected him for his current contributions, not his finance credentials or his relationship to me. He'd earned his place here through work, and everyone knew it. Keith and I grabbed lunch the next week at a sandwich shop near the office. He was in a reflective mood, talking about how different his life looked now compared to a year ago. He said he was happier making less money doing work that mattered than he'd ever been in finance. Watching me build something from nothing had taught him that success wasn't about status or salary. It was about creating real value and being proud of your work. I bit into my sandwich and thought about how far we'd both come from that Thanksgiving dinner. Neither of us was the same person we'd been 6 years ago. We'd both failed and rebuilt ourselves, just in different ways and different timelines. The brother sitting across from me wasn't the golden child who'd mocked my dreams. He was someone who'd learned humility the hard way and was building something new from the pieces. That felt like enough. 3 months after the celebration, my mom called and asked if she and my dad could visit the office. She'd never asked before, never shown interest in seeing what I built, and the request caught me off guard. I said sure and gave her the address. They showed up on a Tuesday afternoon, both dressed like they were attending something formal instead of visiting their son's workplace. I gave them a tour, showing them the design stations, the conference rooms, the client gallery wall where we displayed our best projects. Keith was in a meeting when they arrived, and I watched my mom's face when she saw him through the glass wall, presenting to a client with confidence I hadn't seen in him since before the layoffs. After the tour, my mom pulled me aside near the break room. She looked uncomfortable, fidgeting with her purse strap. She said she'd been thinking about that Thanksgiving dinner 6 years ago, about how she didn't support my idea when I needed her to believe in me. She said she didn't understand what I was building back then, couldn't see the vision, but walking through this office and seeing what I created made her realize she'd been wrong. She told me she was proud of me now. The words felt both too late and exactly what I needed to hear. I thanked her and hugged her, and we didn't talk about it again, but something shifted between us. 2 weeks later, Keith got a call from someone he used to work with in finance. The guy was starting a consulting firm and wanted to know if Bridge Creative needed financial advisory services. Keith took the call in the conference room, and I could see him through the glass, his posture professional but his expression closed off. He handled the inquiry politely, thanked the caller for thinking of him, and declined the opportunity. Later that afternoon, he stopped by my office and told me about the call. He said he had no interest in going back to that world, that finance felt like someone else's life now. He'd found where he belonged, doing work that actually mattered to him, and he wasn't interested in returning to a career that had made him miserable, even when he was successful. 1 year after Keith's application landed on my desk, we were both still at Bridge Creative. Our relationship had evolved into something neither of us expected. We weren't best friends, didn't hang out outside of work or share deep conversations about our feelings, but we were colleagues who respected each other's contributions, who could collaborate on projects without the old resentment poisoning everything. Occasionally, we were brothers who could laugh about how far we'd both come from those family dinners where he mocked my ambitions, and I swallowed my anger. I realized one morning, watching Keith explain brand strategy to a new client, that the best revenge wasn't rejecting him or making him grovel. It was building something good enough that he wanted to be part of it and being secure enough in my own success to let him join. We were both better for it. He'd learned humility and found work he cared about. I'd learned that vindication mattered less than creating something meaningful. That felt more important than any satisfaction I could have gotten from turning him away.